Hello, everyone. How's everybody doing tonight? And thank you for joining this tremendous opportunity, which is spearheaded by my wife, who is a multitasker and does all these different things at the same time, and what she's actually running home from her parents' teachers' conferences. So she allowed me to take control just for a moment till she gets here. Which is usually the case in our marriage anyway. Oh, she's on. Oh, here we go.
Hi, everyone.
Okay, great. It's being recorded. And Esther, do you want to do the quick introduction?
So first of all, I just want to thank everyone for coming, and forgive me. This is the life of a busy teacher, and I really tried my best to leave the school building, but it kept getting grabbed by different parents. So here I am. The first thing I want to do is thank you all for coming, and thank Arthur Kurzweil. I'll give you a brief bio of Arthur, and it really is much, much, much too brief, okay? It's a little bit too humble, but I'll tell you this. Arthur Kurzweil is the author of On the Road with Rabbi Steinsaltz, which I have to tell you, everyone, is one of my favorite books, as well as Pebbles of Wisdom from Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz. In addition, he wrote Kabbalah for Dummies and the Torah for Dummies as part of the well-known For Dummies series. For 20 years, he was the editor-in-chief of Jason Aronson Publishers. He is also the author of From Generation to Generation, How to Trace Your Jewish Genealogy and Family History. He and his wife live in Great Neck, New York. He is also a master magician, and all around, I don't know, he probably would not like it if I called him a polymath, but maybe he fits that description. I've met Arthur a large handful of times, but I feel a deep, deep connection to him. I consider him a good friend. When I read On the Road from Rabbi Steinsaltz, it was as if I was reading something that someone penned from my own soul. So I share a strong bond with him. I think that the 13 Petalled Rose, I remember in the early 90s living in Yerushalayim, so many people had this book on the shelf and on their bookshelves, and yet it remained very uncreased. I think a lot of people got, oh, a book about mysticism or Kabbalah, and it's in English, so it's going to be easy and accessible. And then they encountered the beginning of it and somehow realized that their point of entry wasn't so simple as anticipated. I think over the years, as I've learned this book, I find it's really helpful to have a guide, and I have found that it is, the experience of learning it is invaluable. And I think it's very important that we really learn the definitions of what it is we're talking about when we talk about Torah. And this book lays that foundation of so many fundamental principles. And with that, I welcome you, and take it away, Arthur.
Thank you. So to echo what you just said, this is a tough book. It's a book where when you open the first page and start reading that first paragraph, you put it down and say, this is not for me. I have no idea what the heck he's talking about. Now, there's one thing that I disagree with Rabbi Steinsaltz about, and I'll tell you how it came about that I discovered this. Rabbi Steinsaltz was in New York several years ago, and as my book's title implies, I'm one of his drivers when he came to New York, and he was at the office in Manhattan of the Aleph Society, which is the group that coordinates Rabbi Steinsaltz's trips to the States and lectures around. And I had to go up to the office to pick him up, to bring him someplace. And as I'm walking into the office, I noticed that the rabbi is standing there in the hallway, and there are 4 or 5 people standing around him. And as I approached, and as I approached, I heard somebody say, well, Arthur disagrees with you. So boy, I was in trouble. What does he disagree with you about? He says that you shouldn't begin with the first chapter. You should begin with the 6th chapter. Rabbi Steinsaltz looked at me and he said, if I wanted to start with the book with the 6th chapter, I would have put it in the front. But chapter 1 is the beginning of the book. So I disagree with him about it. Not that he didn't arrange the book in the way he wanted to, but the first chapter chases you away. In fact, the rabbi said in explaining why he put that first chapter there, is he almost wanted to chase people away, in the sense that he wanted to say to the reader, this is a tough book. This is not a book that you're going to put your feet up and relax and just go through it easily. So my feeling is that the 6th chapter, and there's another chapter as well, is an easier chapter. It has no technical terms. It has no strange ideas that you never heard of. It's one simple chapter with one simple idea. And I feel that to do that chapter, to read that chapter, to study that chapter, it gives you an opportunity to hear the way the rabbi communicates ideas, the rhythm of his sentences, the rhythm of his paragraphs. And I feel that chapter number 1 is to, maybe it should be the last chapter one reads. One of the things I wanted to say at the beginning is that this book has a table of contents, but I would suggest that the table of contents is a little deceptive. There's a chapter on Torah. There's a chapter called Holiness. There's a chapter called Mitzvot. And these chapters titles more or less reflect what the contents of the chapter is. But as the late Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan wrote in one of his books, the best way to read a Kabbalistic text is to find the threads that run through the text. So even though the chapter called Torah is more or less about Torah, you find an idea there that you also find in another chapter, in the 3rd chapter, in the 4th chapter, and you begin to discover that there are threads that run through the book. For example, one thread that's in almost every chapter is the idea that what the rabbi is talking about is impossible to understand. In principle, so there's a chapter called Torah, and he begins by saying there's no way to explain what Torah is. There's a chapter called Holiness, and the rabbi says there's no way to grasp what holiness is. And on and on and on, chapter by chapter, there's this notion that you can't understand what, in principle, it's impossible to define or understand these things. The secret of it is that by acknowledging that you can't understand it, it's a giant step in the direction of understanding it. It's one of the paradoxes in the book, and certainly it makes sense. Don't be discouraged when you see that, you'll get used to it after a while. I read a book, a biography of Albert Einstein once, and in the biography it says, in physics, you never understand a new idea, you just get used to it. And with the 13 Petalled Rose, there are lots of things that you don't understand, but you get used to it. After a while, it becomes familiar to you, and you learn about it from different angles, and it begins to add up. Another thread that in the book that runs through the book is that this is a book that talks about levels of consciousness. Now, I don't know about you folks, but I never saw a book about Judaism that talks about levels of consciousness. The place where I know about levels of consciousness is when you go into a New Age bookstore. If you've been in a New Age bookstore, you see that there's lots of different topics, Buddhism and Hinduism and different kinds of Buddhism and all different traditions. And then there's a section of just about every New Age bookstore that I've ever been in that is in the front of the store usually. It's the place where you can't really find a place for the books. There's no clear topic of the book, but so they put it in the front under the section in the bookstore called consciousness. So while the New Age bookstore customers are familiar with the notion of levels of consciousness, it's not something that you find in a Jewish book, but it's certainly one that attracted me. When I first met Rabbi Steinsaltz, I got an appointment to see him. This was about 40 years ago. And I got an appointment to see him. And 3 days later, I was to see him. So what I did that day when I got the appointment was I sat down to think of the most important questions in my life. I figured if this man is who they say he is, I'm going to go for broke. I'm going to think of the most difficult, profound questions that are in my life and present them to him. And one of the things that I said to him is, I told him I've been dabbling in Eastern religions for many years. was never a member of any group, but I dabbled in Eastern religions for a bunch of years. And then I come across the 13 Petalled Rose, and there's so many ideas in this book that I encountered in those Eastern religion books that I was dabbling in. I should say, as an aside, that I grew up in an assimilated home. My parents did not give me a Jewish education, and that's the background that I was coming from. But I knew that notion of levels of consciousness. So so I said to the rabbi, I've been dabbling in Eastern religions, and I've been reading a lot of those books, and then I come across the 13 Petalled Rose, and so many, pardon me, so many of the ideas that I find in those Eastern books, I also find in 13 Petalled Rose. How could it be? And the rabbi looked at me, he said, how could it be otherwise? How could it be otherwise? We're all looking for ideas that are reliable, that are the truth, and we don't have a monopoly on it. And other traditions make the same conclusions and come to the same observations. So the third of three threads that I wanted to mention is opening oneself. In most of the chapters in the 13 Petalled Rose, Rabbi Steinsaltz at some point or other suggests that you open yourself to this material. You don't come to the material with your posture like this and have an attitude, prove it to me. Instead, you should lend yourself to it a little bit. Keep an open mind about it and just try to let the ideas, I'm not saying that you should accept everything. I'm saying and the rabbi is saying just open yourself to it. Now, I was living in Brooklyn, and 3 of my children were born, and it was clear that the apartment that we were living in was too small for 3 children, and we had to move. And I said, I don't care where we move, as long as we stay on the F train, the subway, the F line. At the time, the F train was the best line in the city. In the summer, it was air conditioned. There were new cars. And I thought that the F train was, and the other reason why I wanted to stay on the F train is because if you've ever been on the F train, subway train in New York City, you'll find that from Brooklyn to Manhattan, on almost every car, you can have a minion. You have a minion. You have guys who are studying Talmud. You have women who are studying also. You have women who are reciting Tehillim. And I just like being around those people. It was like Jewish Disneyland to me. That here were all these people who were traditional Jews going from Brooklyn to Manhattan, and I liked being among them. So it was very early in my Jewish education. I didn't have much of an education, as I mentioned, but I did find this book called The 13 Petalled Rose. I was looking for material that I could rely on. I go to the New York Public Library or to any public library, and I go to that wonderful number in the library called 296 in the Dewey Decimal System. 296 is Judaism in the Dewey Decimal System. So I was reading book after book after book, trying to get something of an education. And I got the feeling after a while that each of these books was just one man's opinion. I didn't want just one man's opinion or one woman's opinion. What I wanted somebody who's reliable, somebody who I could trust. And learning more about the Rabbi Steinsaltz, I came to the conclusion that this is somebody who I can trust. So one afternoon, I'm on the F train going from my office in Manhattan back to my home in Brooklyn. And I'm sitting next to a chassid, this Hasidic Jew. I would say he was about 80, 85 years old, dressed like a traditional chassid. And I'm reading the 13 Petalled Rose, trying word by word, sentence by sentence, trying to figure out what the heck he means. And the chassid sitting next to me was reading the New York Post. And I was feeling very good about myself. Because here I am, this assimilated Jew from Long Island who's reading this book of Kabbalah by Rabbi Steinsaltz, and here's the chassid sitting next to me who's reading the rag newspaper of New York City. So I'm sitting there, and I remembered that my first Talmud teacher taught me that in the Talmud it says that you shouldn't go 2 cubits. A cubit is from the tip of your finger to the tip of your elbow. It's the ancient yardstick. You shouldn't go 2 cubits with a fellow Jew without talking Torah. So I was thinking about this and seeing that here are all these Jews around and nobody's talking to anybody because, of course, on this subway, generally speaking, people don't talk to each other. But I'm thinking about the Talmud and this lesson that you shouldn't go 2 cubits without talking Torah. And here's this beautiful chassid next to me. Why don't I talk to him? And I'm trying to get up enough nerve to talk to him, trying to get up enough courage to speak to this man. And finally, I just pushed myself and I said to him, excuse me. And he put the post down. And I said to him, did you ever see this book, The 13 Petalled Rose by Adin Steinsaltz? And he said, no, I never saw this book. And he opens it up and he flips through the first couple of pages. And he said to me, I don't usually read books unless I have 2 haskamas. Now, I knew what a haskama was from my genealogy research. A haskama is like a seal of approval. Today, you see books published by the traditional Jewish publishers where you have these haskamas. You have a couple of rabbis who have read the book, presumably, and will say to the reader, this is a kosher book. And the reason why I knew it from genealogy is because the haskama usually has biographical information about the author. The person who wrote the haskama will say, this is so-and-so, the son of Rabbi so-and-so, the grandson of Rabbi so-and-so, the nephew of this man, and from the town of this town. So you get a little bit of biography of the author from the haskama that's in the book. And here's the chassid next to me on the subway, and he's saying, I don't usually look at books unless I have 2 haskamas, 2 seals of approval. What I wanted to say to him is, where are the haskamas on the New York Post? But I didn't say that to him because I was trying to make friends. I didn't want to make enemies, an enemy there. But he surprised me. He said to me, it's not all that important. What's the book about? And I said to him, it's a book about Judaism, a basic book about Judaism. I showed him the table of contents. And I showed him that in the table of contents, there's a list of the chapters: the soul, holiness, the Torah, repentance, mitzvot. I said it's a basic book about Jewish ideas. He said, I never heard of it before. And I said to him, well, can I ask you a question about something that I just encountered in this book? And he said, sure. And so I opened the book to the place where I knew I had this problem. And this is what I read to him. It has been taught, it has been said, that each of the letters of the Torah has some corresponding soul. That is to say, every soul is a letter in the entire Torah and has its own part to play. The soul that has fulfilled its task, the soul that has done what it has to do in terms of creating or repairing its own part of the world and realizing its own essence, that soul can wait after death for the perfection of the world as a whole. But not all souls are so privileged. Many souls stray for one reason or another. Sometimes a person does not do all the proper things, and sometimes he misuses forces and spoils his portion and spoils the portion of others. In such cases, the soul does not complete its task and may even be damaged itself by contact with the world. It has not managed to complete that portion of reality which only this particular soul can complete, and therefore, after the death of the body, the soul returns and is reincarnated in the body of another person, and again must try and complete what it failed to correct or what it injured in the past. I looked at the chassid and I said, do we believe this? And he said, yes. I said, Jews believe in reincarnation? I never heard of it. He said to me, well, where did you get your Jewish education? And I said, well, I don't have a Jewish education. He said, well, that's why you never heard of it. But it's right here. So we started talking as the F train was winding its way through Manhattan and into Brooklyn. And I was talking to him, and he was asking me questions. And I told him that I didn't grow up with a Jewish education, and I told him that I was having a lot of trouble with a lot of things that I was encountering in Jewish tradition, integrating new ideas into myself and practicing customs and rituals and so forth. I was having a very difficult time. And he looked at me at one point and he said to me, you know, you're luckier than I am. And I said to him, I'm luckier than you are. I just got finished telling you that I got no Jewish education. I'm having lots of difficulty integrating this, understanding and integrating this stuff. How could I be luckier than you are? And he said to me, every Jew is connected to God by a rope. And he was talking metaphorically, of course. Every Jew is connected to God by a rope. Sometimes the rope breaks, as in your case, meaning my case. But he said, when a rope breaks and you take the two ends of that broken rope and tie it together, you're closer than you were had the rope not broken. You're closer to God than I'll ever get. And I learned after that this is a principle of Jewish tradition, that the Baal Tshuva, the newcomer to Judaism, is on a higher level than the high priest, than a great tzaddik is. That in all sincerity, he was saying to me that you're luckier than I am, because you've been tying that, you found those two ends of the rope that broke in your family, and you're tying those two ends of the rope together. And I think that afternoon, this chassid on the subway gave me the metaphor for my life. What I've been trying to do since then is I've been trying to find the two ends of the rope and trying to tie them together. And the 13 Petalled Rose has been more or less my major guide. Now, the 13 Petalled Rose is not a book about Jewish history. It's not a book about Jewish holidays. It's not a book about Jewish customs. It's not a book about any of that kind of stuff that you read in so many books on Judaism. What the 13 Petalled Rose does is it talks about the abstract ideas that hold up the entire edifice of Judaism, the abstract ideas. And one of the reasons why it's a tough book is because it's talking in abstractions. So let me give you an idea of an abstraction. We are not a body. Some people believe you're just a body. You're born, you live, you die. Some people say, no, you're not just a body. You're a body that has a soul. Rabbi Steinsaltz teaches in 13 Petalled Rose that you're not just a body, and you're not a body that has a soul. You're a soul that has a body. Your soul existed before this particular body. Your soul picks up the body and lives for 70, 80, 90 years, whatever it is. Then the soul drops the body and it goes on with its work. So the fact that you're a soul that has a body rather than a body that has a soul is a big idea in Jewish tradition. Or let me give you another one. We don't believe that God created the world. We don't have that belief that God created the world. Our belief is that God creates the world, that God is continuously supporting and creating the world. It isn't that God created the world and then left it. Rather, God creates the world constantly. It's the problem that I have with that famous book that Rabbi Harold Kushner wrote called When Bad Things Happen to Good People. I call that book When Bad Books Happen to Jewish People. Because in that book, he very eloquently describes the classic heretical position in Judaism, in relation to Judaism. Harold Kushner believes that God created the world and then left it alone. We in Jewish tradition, we don't buy that. Instead, we believe that God creates the world constantly. And when you think that through for a little bit of time, you see that it can have an enormous impact on who you are and how you think about your life. When the Talmud, when Rabbi Steinsaltz's translation of the Talmud into English was first published, the first two books were published by Random House. The United States Senate invited Rabbi Steinsaltz to a luncheon in his honor on the occasion of the publication of the first English language Talmud. And Rabbi Steinsaltz gave me the honor of going down to Washington, D.C. to be with him. I actually photocopied the page that he was going to teach, and I passed it around to all of the senators and to the other dignitaries. That were a couple of people from the Supreme Court and a couple of rabbis from local synagogues. And Rabbi Steinsaltz gets up with the photocopy of this page from the Talmud in front of him, in front of all of us. And he begins for about 10 minutes to talk about that page. he then sits down, and I go back to my chair also, and I happen to be sitting next to a conservative rabbi who was the rabbi of a certain synagogue in the Washington, D.C. area. And when I sat down next to him for lunch, I said to him, "Do you have a Talmud class in your synagogue?" And he said, "No." I said, "Why not?" He said, "It would take me 30 hours to prepare what Rabbi Steindl just did in 10 minutes. So I don't have a Talmud class in my synagogue." So that evening, when the rabbi and I flew back to New York, when I was on the plane with him, I told him this incident about this rabbi who told me that it would take him 30 hours to do 10 minutes of Talmud study. So he doesn't there's no Talmud study in his synagogue. And Rabbi Steindl looked at me and said to me, "You see, that's the problem. Somebody convinced that guy that he was too stupid to do it. So he doesn't do it, and his congregation doesn't do it, and it's just not there. So I want to take that same idea to Kabbalah, to the 13 Petalled Rose, and say that we're not too stupid to do it. That first paragraph might be intimidating. That first chapter is intimidating. The second chapter might be even more intimidating. The third chapter isn't that much better or that more comprehensible. But we can do it. And what my goal is for the 4 sessions that we're going to be together is try to open this book up a little bit and to show you that you don't have to be intimidated by the first, second, or third chapters. Rather, we'll go through a chapter together, and you'll see slowly but surely how you can understand every word in that chapter, and you could probably even teach that chapter once you go through it. There was a meeting several years back. Oh, this goes back about 25 years, when Rabbi Steindl was asked to be the keynote speaker at the New York Board of Rabbis. Now, the New York Board of Rabbis is one of these miracle organizations because it's all flavor rabbis, and everybody is alive by the end of the day. Nobody's killed. Everybody seems to get along with each other. Rabbi Steindl was the keynote, and the place was mobbed. There was not only no seating room, and no standing room, but the people were going out or out the door trying to listen to Rabbi Steindl give the keynote address. And he gets up in front of all these rabbis and he says, "Kabbalah is the official theology of the Jewish people." He then said, "Let me repeat that. Kabbalah is the official theology of the Jewish people." He said to these rabbis, "If you're not studying it, if you're not teaching it, then one could probably say you're not doing your job. Kabbalah is the official theology of the Jewish people." And then for the next hour and a half, he defended that position and explained to us why he feels very strongly that Kabbalah is the official theology of the Jewish people. And we have to study it. This idea that you have to be married and 40 years old and be a man and be steeped in Torah before you can study Kabbalah, Rabbi Steindl says it's just not true anymore. There's so much misinformation out there about Kabbalah that I have an obligation to try to clear up some things, to try to improve one's understanding of Kabbalah. So we're going to go through this book, and we're going to go through it, and then Rabbi Green is going to take over and going to go through it much more closely and much more carefully. But my goal over these next few weeks is simply to open the book up to you and to make it palatable. Now, there's an interesting passage in the Talmud about how we get the philtrum. I'm putting my finger here because that notch above your upper lip, that's in the middle there, right below your nose, that little notch there is called a philtrum. And there's a story in the Talmud that before a baby is born, what is it doing? And the Talmud says what it's doing is it's learning Torah, and it learns the entire Torah from beginning to end. And then just before it's born, an angel comes along and taps it on the mouth, creating the philtrum, and also knocking all of the knowledge out of the baby. So the baby then forgets the entire Torah. So that rather than our studying this for the first time, we already know all this. Let me show you what I mean. In this edition of the 13 Petaled Rose, which was an earlier edition, I asked Rabbi Steinsaltz if he would write an introduction to the book, because the first edition did not have an introduction. So in the introduction, he writes the following: "This little book is a book for the soul. It begins quite deliberately with a view of another reality. It does not proceed from this world or from the familiar ways of man in our society. Instead, it seeks to go from the genuine center of all being to the world and to human life. There's no attempt here to speak of Judaism, to prove its worth or to justify it, rather to let the message communicate itself. And if a person permits his soul to listen, the soul will soon learn that all it needs to do is remember, because in some dim and enigmatic way, it already knows all this." So Rabbi Sanders is starting with the assumption that we already know all of this, and that our education is not discovering new stuff, but rather it's remembering what we already knew. We already knew the entire Torah. That angel knocked it out of us, but the process of learning is really a process of remembering. I wanted to say that I once heard Rabbi Steinsaltz being asked a question where the questioner said to the rabbi, "How do you do what you do? You go into a synagogue, a Reform temple, you're sitting there teaching Torah to men and women together. The men are bareheaded. And how do you do that? How do you do that?" And he said to me, "Well, I focus on a person's essence, not on their shell. And if I focus on a person's essence, not on their shell, then I can talk to anybody. So that's my way of doing it." So I had the privilege many years ago to meet with Elie Wiesel once a week for the better part of a year. I kind of wormed my way into his life a little bit, and I had the privilege of meeting with him once a week for almost a year. One day I was sitting in his office, in Elie Wiesel's office at City College, which is where he was teaching at the time, and we were talking, and suddenly there's a knock on the door, and the door opens, and the man who comes into the room says, "I got an appointment." Elie Wiesel said, "When?" The guy said, "Right now, today. Do you want to go?" Wiesel said, "Yes, let's go." Then he turned to me and said, "This gentleman is a teacher, a professor in the English department, and he told me about this Kabbalist who lives in the Bronx, and I was intrigued, and I wanted to meet him." So the professor was going to take Wiesel up to the Bronx to meet this Kabbalist. So he turned to me and he said, "Do you want to come along?" Well, it took me about a millisecond to say yes. Of course I wanted to come along. So I went up with him and the professor to this Kabbalist's home, his apartment. And when I walked in, I saw this little man, the long beard and the yarmulke, and he comes right up to me, right up to my face. And he said to me, "So tell me, what are you interested in?" Now, at the time, I was interested in genealogy. I was obsessed with genealogy. And I said to him, I'm interested in genealogy. And the Kabbalist said to me, "Can you tell me what that means in one sentence?" And I don't remember what I said to him, but I, in one sentence, tried to explain to him why I'm interested in genealogy. And then I looked at the Kabbalist and I said to him, "So I understand that you're into Kabbalah. Can you explain to me what that means in one sentence?" And he said, "Sure. In the beginning, there was a cataclysm." I didn't know it then, but today I know that what he was referring to was the Ari's idea that God poured his divine light into a vessel, and the vessel couldn't contain the divine light, so the vessel shattered, and all the stuff of the world are the pieces of that shattered vessel that have embedded within it the divine light. And our job in life is to break open those pieces of that shattered vessel and to release the divine light. So he said to me, in the beginning there was a cataclysm. he then looked at me and he said to me, I can explain to you what Kabbalah is in less than a sentence. In fact, I can explain to you what Kabbalah is without uttering a sound, without uttering a word. So I said, how do you do that? He said, this is Kabbalah. Now, I didn't know what he was talking about or not talking about. I didn't know what he was trying to communicate to me. But after a bunch of years, I now understand that we have a notion in Jewish tradition, na'aseh v'nishma. We will do and we will understand. Now, usually it's the opposite. Usually I want to understand something and then I'll do it. But in Jewish tradition, what did we say when the God was offering us a Torah? Na'aseh v'nishma. We will do and we will understand. And that's what the Kabbalist was telling me, that you can't learn Kabbalah from a distance. You can't learn Kabbalah. You have to taste it. You have to jump into it, get involved with it, and taste it. And what I'm going to try to do, and what Rabbi Green is going to try to do over these weeks, is to try to get us to be intimate with this material, to not look at it from a distance, but to taste it, to actually taste the material. Now, first I'll do it, and then I'll understand it. So I see from my watch that we have about 5 minutes of our 45 minutes. So I want to just pause for a moment and ask if anybody has any comments or questions at the moment. Anybody have anything? Okay, I understand that, but so we'll get to know each other a little bit more down the road. So, but I wanted to say that in the 13 Petalled Rose, Rabbi Steinsaltz asked the question, what is the Jewish way of holiness? What do we do in the Beis Midrash? We're sitting and we're studying, mostly we're studying Talmud. And the Talmud is filled with questions and doubts and skepticism and questions and skepticism and doubts. And at a certain point, you got volumes and volumes and volumes of skepticism and questions and doubt. And at a certain point, you hear somebody go, which is the Gabbai or somebody in the Beis Midrash who's saying, okay, everybody, it's time to pray. It's time to daven. So everybody puts aside their Talmud and picks up their prayer book and we daven. And what is the prayer book? It's one volume of faith. Faith, 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 faith. That one. Then what do? You finish your davening and you put the book aside, and you go back to your 63 volumes of doubt, questions and skepticism and more questions until you hear the Gabbai going. In which case you set aside your questions and your doubts, 63 volumes of it, and you go over to your one volume of faith. Rabbi Steinsaltz says in 13 Petalled Rose, to get stuck in either place is a grievous error. But going back and forth between the two, that's the Jewish way of holiness. We doubt, we question, we ponder, and then we set it aside, and then we express our faith, but then we set it aside, and we go back to our doubt, and our questioning, our doubt, and that bouncing back and forth between the two is the Jewish way of holiness. One other notion in this book that I wanted to mention was a simple sentence that is gigantic for me, for most of us, I'm sure. He said, "If you think you've arrived, you're lost. If you think you've arrived, you're lost." We can never reach God. There's no way. Only God can reach us. We can't. There's an infinite gap between us and God. An infinite gap. There's no way to get to the goal. If you think you've arrived, you're lost. So the question is, if there's no end to this, if we just go on and on and on and on, how do we know that we've made any progress? How do we know that we're going in the right direction? If it constantly, there's more and there's more, you get to a next level and next level and next level. And how do you get a sense of whether you're making any progress? And Rabbi Seindel says in this book, what you do is every once in a while you stop and you look backwards and you see how far you've come. And then you can turn around again and then go more and more into that endless search for God, that endless search for God. These are some of the ideas that are in the 13 Petalled Rose. I'm gonna share some more ideas with you as the weeks go on. But that's my presentation for this evening. I want to just urge you, come back next week and you'll see that we're going to look at a chapter that you're going to understand. It's not going to be impossible. You're not going to have to chip away at every sentence and every word. And there's no technical words. There are some chapters that there are lots of technical terms. And to master these technical terms feels impossible for the newcomer to this material. But you'll see that when you get to know, again, the way the rabbi expresses ideas, how he structures his sentences, how he communicates what he wants to communicate, you kind of get used to it, and it helps you tremendously in your journey in trying to get a hold of this book. So I hope that my presentation this evening was of some interest, and on the subject. I tried to stay on the subject, and thank you very much for having me here. I look forward to next week when we can roll up our sleeves and get into it more. Thanks very much.
That was so great. It was such a fabulous introduction. That story about between the Gemara, the Talmud, and the Siddur is so profound, very, very, very touching. And I don't mean that in a light way. I really think this is a great introduction. I'm so happy to see so many people here, and I want to encourage you. Some people, first of all, just to say, some people are like, oh, is it okay? I might not be able to make it this week. I'm going to come next week, or I might be late. I really want you to know, like, come every week. If you miss things, don't worry. Like, you can still keep, like, this is like an ongoing cycle of learning, and you can, come in, and if you have to step out, you can come back in. Don't worry. The other thing I want to say is that after these 4 weeks, then this guy next to me, Shmuley Green, will be going through each chapter very slowly and in depth and in detail. And
we'll see you next week.
We'll see you next week. Arthur, thank you so much. And thank you all for taking time. If anyone needs a copy of the book, if you live local to me and you didn't get one, I have one extra that has been claimed, and I can order more. Just let me know as soon as possible.
And you can tell your friends about this class, because
welcome as many people as possible. Thank you all.
Everyone.
Thank you.